I wasn't supposed to be there that night. If I'd just stayed home, none of this would have happened. But I let my curiosity get the best of me. It started as a stupid dare, one of those late night challenges you regret the moment you say yes. Spend an hour in the Black Hollow Cemetery, they said. It's just an old cemetery. Nothing's going to happen. Well, something did happen. Something I'll never forget. Black Hollow Cemetery is infamous around here, not because of its age, though it's been there since the 1700s, but because of the stories. People talk about the mourning woman, a ghost who lures the living to their deaths. My friends didn't believe it. Neither did I. Not really. But when I stepped past the iron gates that night, the air felt wrong. It was heavy, like it didn't want me there. My flashlight barely cut through the fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. The headstones were old and weathered, some tilted as if trying to escape the earth. 60 minutes, I muttered, gripping my phone. Then I'm out of here. The first 15 minutes were uneventful, just the occasional owl hoot or rustle of leaves. I sat on a stone bench, scrolling my phone to distract myself. That's when I heard it, a faint sobbing. I froze. My heart started racing. The sound was so soft, so mournful, like someone was grieving deeply. I told myself it was probably just the wind, but my gut said otherwise. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. It led me deeper into the cemetery, to an area I didn't even know existed. The headstones here were older, cracked, and covered in moss. In the middle of it all was a large, crumbling mausoleum. The crying grew louder. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly. Then I saw her. She was standing just a few feet away, a woman in a tattered black dress. Her face was pale, almost glowing in the moonlight, and her dark hair clung to her face as if she'd been caught in a storm. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. They were hollow, black pits, like the very essence of darkness stared back at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. She tilted her head, and I swear I heard her whisper my name. "No," I stammered, stepping back. "You're not real." Her lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice like a cold wind slicing through my ears. That's when I ran. I don't even remember turning around, but I ran as fast as I could, weaving between headstones, tripping over roots. The air grew colder, and my breath came out in frantic puffs. But she was always there, just at the edge of my vision. No matter how fast I ran, I could feel her presence. I reached the gate and slammed into it. It wouldn't budge. The old iron bars that had been wide open when I came in were now sealed shut, as if the cemetery itself didn't want to let me go. I turned around, pressing my back against the gate, clutching the cold metal like a lifeline. She was standing just a few feet away now, her hollow eyes fixed on mine. "Why are you doing this?" I screamed. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised one pale hand and pointed to something behind me. I turned, trembling, and saw a headstone I hadn't noticed before. It was newer than the others, pristine and unweathered, and it had my name on it. "No," I gasped, stumbling back. "This isn't real. This isn't real." She stepped closer, her black eyes burning into me. "You should have stayed away," she said softly. "Now you're mine." Something cold wrapped around my ankles, and I looked down to see skeletal hands clawing out of the ground, gripping me, dragging me down. I screamed and thrashed, but it was no use. The earth swallowed me inch by inch, the damp soil filling my mouth, my nose, until everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold stone floor of the mausoleum. My phone was dead, my flashlight cracked. I don't know how long I'd been there, but it was morning. I ran out of there as fast as I could, not even stopping to look back. When I told my friends, they thought I was joking. They laughed, called me a coward. But I know what I saw, and the worst part? Every night since, I've heard her sobbing. It's faint, but it's there, just outside my window. She's waiting for me.
Story number 2.
I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. Either way, that decision will haunt me for the rest of my life. It all started with an old urban legend. Everyone in my town knows about the gravedigger's shadow, the spirit of a long-dead cemetery keeper who's said to linger in Pine Haven Cemetery. According to the story, he wasn't just any caretaker. He was a murderer. In the late 1800s, he used to lure grave visitors into his small stone house under the guise of kindness, offering tea and warmth. They'd never leave. Some say he buried them alive in empty plots. Others say he kept their bodies in the crypt. When his crimes were discovered, an angry mob dragged him into the cemetery he had tended for years and hung him from the ancient oak that still stands in the center. Before he died, he swore revenge on anyone who dared enter Pine Haven after dark. It's just a story, right? At least, that's what I told myself when my friends dared me to go. Spend an hour there alone, they said. No flashlight, no phone, just you and your courage. I didn't want to look like a coward, so I said yes. The night I went, the sky was overcast, the kind of cloudy that swallows the moonlight and leaves everything in eerie darkness. The cemetery gate was heavy, creaking loudly as I pushed it open. I had only a small lantern, one of those dim battery-powered things you'd find at a dollar store. The silence was oppressive. No crickets, no wind, just the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel path. The air felt colder the further in I went, biting through my jacket. I walked to the center of the cemetery where the infamous hanging tree stood. The massive oak was gnarled and twisted, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. A frayed rope swing hung from one of the lower branches, swaying gently, though there wasn't even a breeze. I sat on a broken stone bench beneath the tree, glancing at my watch. 58 minutes to go. For a while, nothing happened. The quiet was unnerving, but it was just that, quiet. I started to think the story was nonsense, and then I heard the scraping. It was faint at first, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. I froze, gripping the lantern tighter. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was impossible to ignore. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow glided between the headstones, low and quick. "Who's there?" I demanded, standing up. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to stay put. The scraping sound stopped. That's when I saw it. He stepped out from behind a tall, crumbling headstone, a figure dressed in tattered overalls and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was obscured, but his eyes, oh God, his eyes. They glowed like embers, piercing through the darkness. He carried a rusted shovel, the blade caked with dirt. With every step he took, the blade dragged along the ground, creating that horrible scraping noise. "Get away," I shouted, my voice cracking. He didn't stop. I stumbled backward, tripping over the bench and falling hard onto the ground. The lantern rolled away, flickering, casting distorted shadows across the graves. That's when I noticed something even worse. The graves around me weren't just graves anymore. The earth was moving, shifting, as if something or someone was clawing its way out. Skeletal hands broke through the soil, followed by faces, hollow-eyed and decayed. They were everywhere, crawling toward me. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the lantern, and ran. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear them, footsteps, shuffling, dragging noises, and a low, guttural growl. The gate was in sight, but as I got closer, I saw him again, the gravedigger, standing just beyond the exit. He didn't move, just stared at me with those burning eyes. I hesitated for half a second too long, and that's when I felt something grab my ankle. I looked down to see a skeletal hand clutching me, its bony fingers impossibly strong. I screamed and kicked, finally breaking free. I didn't think, I just ran straight at the gravedigger. I expected him to grab me, to swing that shovel and end it all. But as I reached him, he simply vanished into thin air. I ran all the way home, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My friends were waiting for me, laughing and ready to tease me for chickening out. But when they saw my face, their smiles faded. "What happened?" one of them asked. I didn't answer. I just pointed to my ankle. The bone-white print of a hand was burned into my skin, dark and blistered. I never went back to Pine Haven Cemetery. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that scraping sound outside my window, faint but unmistakable. I know he's still watching.
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be just another night shift at the motel. Quiet, boring, and uneventful. That's how it had been for the last 3 years. I worked the front desk of the Ridgewood Inn, a rundown, off-the-highway kind of place where people stopped only if they had nowhere else to go. We had the usual cast of guests, truckers, families with tired kids, and the occasional sketchy loner. But that night, we had something different. It started around 11 p.m. when a woman walked in. She was dressed in an old-fashioned black dress, the kind you'd see in photos from the early 1900s. Her hair was neatly tied back, her skin pale and flawless, almost too flawless like a porcelain doll. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft but cold. "I'd like a room." She didn't have luggage, just a small handbag clutched tightly in her gloved hands. Something about her put me on edge, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was her eyes, dark, unblinking, and staring a little too intensely. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. "How many nights?" Just one, she replied, sliding a crisp $50 bill across the counter. I handed her the key to room 12 and watched as she walked down the dimly lit hallway. Her movements were graceful but unnatural, like she was gliding rather than walking. As the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling she left behind. Something wasn't right. Around 2 a.m., the phone at the front desk rang. I picked it up, expecting a complaint about the old heater or the spotty Wi-Fi. "Front desk," I said. Silence. "Hello?" And then I heard it, a faint whisper. "Help me." My stomach dropped. "Who is this?" The line went dead. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, maybe one of the other guests messing with me, but the unease wouldn't go away. I decided to check the security cameras to distract myself. Flipping through the feeds, everything seemed normal at first. The parking lot was empty, the hallways quiet. But when I switched to the camera for room 12, my blood ran cold. The woman wasn't in her room. Instead, she was standing in the hallway, staring directly at the camera. Her head was tilted, and her eyes, they weren't normal anymore. They were pitch black, like two voids sucking in all the light. I blinked, and she was gone. I jumped out of my chair, heart racing. This had to be a glitch, I thought, or maybe I was just imagining things. But then I heard it. A faint knock coming from the office door behind me. I froze. The office was supposed to be locked. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. Slowly, I got up and walked to the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. Taking a deep breath, I flung it open. No one was there. But on the desk inside the office, something caught my eye. It was a photograph, old and yellowed with age. I picked it up, and my heart nearly stopped. It was her. The woman in the black dress. She was standing in front of the motel, smiling faintly, but there was something horribly wrong with the picture. Behind her, the windows of the motel were shattered, and the building looked burned and abandoned. The date scrawled on the back of the photo read, October 12th, 1928. I stumbled back, dropping the photo. The moment it hit the floor, the lights in the lobby flickered, then went out completely. I was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. And then I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the hallway. The beam illuminated the long corridor, empty except for the cracked walls and faded carpet. "Is anyone there?" I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. I turned back to the desk, and that's when I saw her. She was standing just a few feet away, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes, now black as coal, locked onto mine. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. Before I could react, the flashlight flickered and went out. The darkness swallowed me, and I felt the air grow colder, like the life was being sucked out of the room. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my phone to use its flashlight, but when I turned it on, she was gone. The rest of the night was a blur. I didn't leave the front desk. I didn't move. I just sat there, clutching the flashlight and staring at the security monitors. When morning finally came, the sunlight streaming through the windows felt like a blessing. I got up, trembling, and went to check room 12. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the bed was perfectly made, the room untouched as if no one had been there at all. But on the nightstand, there was something that hadn't been there before, a small, black-gloved handprint burned into the wood. I quit that job the next day, but even now, years later, I can't forget her face. Every so often, I'll wake up in the middle of the night and see her standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with those black, hollow eyes.
Story number 4.
I was 16 when it happened, but I still can't talk about it without shaking. It's the kind of thing that stays with you, burrowing deep into your mind and refusing to let go. My best friend Tyler and I used to explore abandoned places. We thought it was fun, a little rebellious and harmless. We'd heard about this old crumbling mansion on the outskirts of town, the Oakwood Estate. Everyone in town said it was haunted, but that only made us more eager to check it out. The mansion had been abandoned for over 100 years. The story went that the Oakwood family disappeared one night in the late 1800s, leaving everything behind. Some said they'd been cursed. Others whispered about dark rituals. All I knew was that the place had a reputation, and Tyler was itching to go. We picked a Friday night, packed our flashlights and some snacks, and biked out to the edge of town. The mansion loomed at the top of a hill, surrounded by overgrown trees and weeds. The windows were shattered, the front door hanging off its hinges. "Creepy," Tyler said, grinning as we walked up the cracked stone steps. Yeah, no kidding, I muttered, already regretting the whole idea. Inside, the air was stale and thick with the smell of rot. The floorboards creaked under our weight, and cobwebs hung from every corner. It felt like the house was alive, watching us, waiting. We wandered through the dusty rooms, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Most of the furniture was still there: old chairs, a grand piano with broken keys, even a cracked mirror above the fireplace. "Let's check upstairs," Tyler said, his voice way too cheerful for the setting. I followed him reluctantly. The staircase groaned with every step, and I half expected it to collapse under us. The second floor was worse. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with doors that led to bedrooms and what looked like a study. "Let's split up," Tyler suggested, and I immediately shook my head. "Not a chance," I said. "I'm not going anywhere alone." He rolled his eyes but didn't argue. We started with the study, shining our flashlights on old bookshelves and a desk covered in yellowed papers. That's when we heard it. A faint knock coming from somewhere further down the hall. We froze, staring at each other. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Yeah," Tyler said, his voice tight. We stood there for what felt like forever, listening. The knock came again, louder this time. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, like someone was knocking on a door. "Maybe it's the wind," Tyler said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Wind doesn't knock," I shot back. The sound came again, and this time it was followed by something even worse, a low, guttural whisper. "Get out." I grabbed Tyler's arm. "We're leaving. Now." But Tyler, always the thrill seeker, shook me off. "No way. We've got to see what it is." Before I could stop him, he was heading down the hall toward the sound. I didn't want to be left alone, so I followed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The knocking and whispering led us to a door at the very end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and cold air seeped out from the crack. Tyler pushed it open, his flashlight illuminating a small, empty bedroom. At first, there was nothing unusual, just a dusty bed, a broken dresser, and torn curtains. But then, our flashlights landed on the far corner of the room, and we saw her. She was crouched there, facing the wall, her long, tangled hair hiding her face. She was wearing a filthy white dress, stained and torn, and her thin, pale arms were wrapped around her knees. "Hello?" Tyler said, his voice barely audible. She didn't move. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I asked, though my legs were trembling so badly I could barely stand. Slowly, she turned her head. Her face was wrong. Her skin was gray and sagging, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that stretched too far. But it was her eyes that terrified me the most. They were completely black, endless voids that seemed to suck the light out of the room. "Leave," she hissed, her voice a horrible mix of a growl and a whisper. Tyler screamed. I grabbed his arm and yanked him out of the room. We ran as fast as we could, barreling down the hallway, the staircase, and out the front door. But it didn't stop there. As we sprinted across the overgrown yard, I glanced back at the mansion. She was standing in the broken window of the second floor, watching us. Her grin had grown wider, and her black eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. We didn't stop running until we reached our bikes. Even then, I felt like she was still watching us, her presence clinging to my back like a shadow. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing her voice in my head, that raspy leave echoing over and over. A week later, Tyler told me he'd been having nightmares about her too. He wouldn't talk about what he saw in his dreams, but he looked pale and exhausted. And then one day, Tyler disappeared. They found his bike on the side of the road near the mansion, but no sign of him. The police searched the area, but they never found his body. I think about him every day, and sometimes when I'm alone, I hear faint knocking. I know she hasn't forgotten me.
Story number 5.
The last time I saw my brother Ethan was the night he dared me to summon the Midnight Man. It started as a stupid game, something we found on the internet. A ritual, they called it, where you invite a dark entity into your home. Supposedly, the Midnight Man would hunt you, and if he caught you, the consequences were worse than death. "You're not scared, are you?" Ethan teased, holding up the printed instructions. I wasn't scared of much back then, or at least that's what I told myself. Ethan and I had a competitive streak, and I wasn't about to let him think I was a coward. "What do we need?" I asked, feigning confidence. "A candle, a piece of paper, a pen, matches, a wooden door, and a pinch of salt," Ethan recited. It sounded simple enough, but the warning at the bottom of the page gave me pause. "Do not play this game unless you are prepared to face the consequences." Still, I wasn't about to back out. Ethan gathered the supplies while I read the instructions aloud. We had to write our full names on the paper, prick our fingers, and let a drop of blood fall onto it. Then we were to place the paper in front of the door, light the candle, and knock 22 times, making sure the last knock came exactly at midnight. "You ready?" Ethan asked, grinning. "Let's do it," I said, though my hands were already trembling. We sat cross-legged in front of the wooden door in the basement, the cold concrete floor seeping through my jeans. Ethan went first, writing his name in shaky letters, pricking his finger with a pin, and smearing a tiny drop of blood on the paper. I followed, my stomach twisting into knots. At exactly 11:59 p.m., we placed the paper in front of the door, lit the candle, and began knocking. The sound echoed eerily in the silence, each knock growing heavier in my chest. On the 22nd knock, we blew out the candle and stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was deathly quiet, save for the faint hum of the basement light. And then we heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching on the other side of the door. My breath caught. I looked at Ethan, but he just smirked, clearly enjoying my discomfort. "It's probably just a rat," he whispered, but the scratching grew louder, more deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. "Rats don't do that," I whispered back. Ethan relit the candle, holding it up to the door. The flame flickered wildly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Suddenly, there was a loud thud, like something heavy had slammed against the door. We both jumped, and Ethan's grin disappeared. "Maybe we should stop," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't stop," Ethan replied, his bravado faltering. "The game isn't over until 3:33 a.m. We just have to survive until then." The rules were clear. If the candle went out, we had 10 seconds to relight it. If we couldn't, we had to surround ourselves with a circle of salt and stay inside until the time was up. The next few minutes were tense, but quiet. We sat on the floor, the candle between us, listening to every creak and groan of the old house. Then the temperature dropped. It was subtle at first, but soon I could see my breath in the flickering candlelight. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, stretching across the walls like grasping hands. "Do you feel that?" I whispered. Ethan nodded, his eyes darting around the room. And then we heard the footsteps. They were faint but unmistakable, slow, deliberate, and coming from the other side of the basement. "There's someone down here," I hissed. "Don't be stupid," Ethan said, though his voice was barely a whisper. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the circle of light cast by our candle. I strained my eyes, but the darkness was impenetrable. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the light. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long and twisted. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, boring into me. "Ethan," I croaked, unable to tear my eyes away. "I see it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. Then, without warning, the candle went out. Panic surged through me as the room was plunged into darkness. Ethan fumbled with the matches, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them. "Light it! Light it!" I screamed. "I'm trying!" he shouted back, striking match after match, but they wouldn't catch. The air grew heavier, suffocating, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. In a blind panic, I grabbed the salt and poured it in a circle around us. The moment the circle was complete, the oppressive weight lifted, and the figure stepped back into the shadows. For the next 3 hours, we sat huddled in the salt circle, clutching the candle and praying for the sun to rise. Every so often, we'd hear faint whispers or see movement in the darkness, but the figure never came closer. When 3:33 a.m. finally came, the air suddenly warmed and the oppressive darkness lifted. We didn't say a word as we bolted out of the basement, up the stairs, and out of the house. Ethan never spoke about that night again, and neither did I. But something followed us. Even now, years later, I wake up at midnight to the sound of faint knocking on my bedroom door, and I know Ethan hears it too.
Story number 6.
I used to be a night nurse at a hospice in a small town. It was quiet, peaceful for the most part, but it could also be incredibly lonely. The building was old, with creaking floors, dim hallways, and a perpetual chill that no amount of heating could ever fix. The hospice had a reputation. Some of the other nurses swore it was haunted. Lights flickering, whispers in empty rooms, doors opening and closing on their own. It was all par for the course. I didn't believe in any of it. I chalked it up to nerves and overactive imaginations. That was until the night I met her. It was a Tuesday, a slow shift. Most of the patients were asleep, their soft breathing and the hum of machines the only sounds in the building. I was doing my rounds when I noticed something strange. Room 206 was empty. Its previous occupant had passed away a week ago, and no one new had been admitted yet. But as I walked past, I thought I heard something, a faint humming like a child singing. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear. The humming grew louder, and it was definitely coming from room 206. My heart raced as I slowly opened the door. The room was dark, the bed neatly made, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering in the air. But in the corner near the window was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. She wore a tattered white dress, her hair long and tangled, and she was sitting cross-legged on the floor, facing away from me. "Sweetie, what are you doing here?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer, just kept humming that eerie tune. "Are you lost?" I tried again, stepping into the room. The temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in the air, and a deep sense of unease settled over me. "Sweetheart, I need you to come with me," I said, reaching out a hand. The girl stopped humming. Slowly, she turned her head to look at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and hollow, like twin voids that seemed to swallow the dim light of the room. And then she smiled. It wasn't a child's smile. It was too wide, too sharp, filled with something dark and menacing. "Do you want to play with me?" she whispered, her voice raspy and wrong. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "No, I think it's time for you to go back to your parents." "They're not here," she said, standing up. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being yanked by invisible strings. "Then who brought you here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head, her smile never faltering. "He did." Before I could ask who she meant, the room's light flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my flashlight and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the shadows. But when I pointed it at the corner where the girl had been, she was gone. The room was empty. I stumbled out, my mind racing. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. But as I walked back down the hallway, I heard it again. The faint humming, this time coming from another room. Room 213. I didn't want to go, but something compelled me to. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the sound. The door to room 2113 was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The girl was there again, sitting on the bed this time, her back to me. "Why are you here?" I managed to ask. She turned slowly, her empty eyes locking onto mine. "He's coming," she whispered. "Who? Who's coming?" But she didn't answer. She began to hum again, the haunting melody filling the room. The air grew colder, and suddenly the door slammed shut behind me. The flashlight flickered, and I felt a presence, a heavy, oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. And then I saw it. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, standing in the corner of the room. Its head nearly touched the ceiling, and its arms stretched unnaturally long, ending in claw-like hands. The girl smiled at me, her teeth sharp and glinting in the faint light. "He's here." The shadow moved. It didn't walk or glide. It just seemed to shift, appearing closer with each flicker of the flashlight. I backed against the wall, my heart racing as the shadow loomed over me. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was a swirling mass of darkness, featureless except for 2 glowing red eyes. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." Its voice was a guttural growl, echoing in my mind rather than the room. I screamed, dropping the flashlight. The beam spun wildly, casting chaotic shadows on the walls. When I grabbed it and pointed it back at the corner, both the girl and the shadow were gone. I bolted out of the room, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air stinging my face. The next day, I quit my job at the hospice. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. They'd think I was crazy. But even now, years later, I can still hear that humming sometimes. And when I do, I know he's watching.
Story number 7.
I grew up in a quiet rural town surrounded by miles of dense forest. It was the kind of place where nothing much happened, except for the disappearances. Every year, like clockwork, someone in our town would go missing. No signs, no warnings, just gone. People whispered about the forest, saying it was cursed, but no one ever had an explanation. I never believed in curses. Not until the summer, my best friend, Jake, disappeared. We were 16, bored out of our minds and always looking for trouble. That day, we decided to explore the old hiking trails deep in the woods, the ones everyone avoided. "Bet you $50 we don't find anything," Jake said, smirking as he slung his backpack over his shoulder. "You're on," I replied, though something about the forest had always made me uneasy. The trails were overgrown, the air thick with the scent of moss and damp earth. The deeper we went, the darker it got, as if the trees were swallowing the sunlight. After an hour of walking, we stumbled upon something strange, a clearing with a stone circle in the middle. Dude, what is that? Jake asked, stepping closer. The stones were ancient, covered in moss and strange carvings. They formed a perfect ring, and in the center was a patch of blackened earth. It's just some old fire pit, I said, though I didn't believe it. Jake grinned, pulling out his phone. This is so going on Insta. As he stepped into the circle, a cold wind swept through the clearing, rustling the leaves. I shivered, suddenly feeling like we were being watched. Maybe we shouldn't mess with this, I said. Relax, Jake replied, snapping pictures. It's just rocks. But then something happened. The wind stopped. The forest went deathly silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. And the air grew heavy, pressing down on us like a weight. Jake, I whispered, my voice trembling. He turned to me, his grin fading. Do you feel that? Before I could answer, the blackened earth in the center of the circle began to shift. At first, it looked like shadows were moving, but then I realized it wasn't shadows, it was something rising. A figure emerged from the ground, tall and impossibly thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Jake froze, his phone slipping from his hand. Run! I screamed, grabbing his arm. We bolted back toward the trail, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. But the thing was fast. I could hear it behind us, its footsteps crunching the leaves, its breath a low, guttural rasp. Don't look back! I shouted, to feel its presence closing in. Jake stumbled, falling to the ground. I turned to help him, but before I could reach him, the thing grabbed him. Its long, bony fingers wrapped around his ankle, and it started dragging him back toward the clearing. Help me! Jake screamed, his eyes wide with terror. I grabbed a branch and swung it at the creature, but it didn't even flinch. Its black eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold, paralyzing fear seep into my bones. You shouldn't have come, it rasped, its voice like nails scraping glass. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as it dragged Jake into the darkness. His screams echoed through the forest, growing fainter and fainter until there was nothing but silence. When I finally found the strength to move, I ran. I don't remember how I made it out of the forest or how long it took, but when I reached town, I collapsed on the sheriff's doorstep, sobbing. A search party was organized, but they never found Jake. No tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I told them about the stone circle and the creature, but no one believed me. They said it was the stress, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing's face, heard its rasping voice. And then one night, I heard something else. A knock at my window. I froze, my heart pounding. My bedroom was on the second floor. There was no way anyone could be outside. But the knock came again, louder this time. Trembling, I pulled back the curtain. Jake was standing there, but it wasn't Jake. His skin was pale, almost gray, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He smiled at me, his lips stretching too wide, revealing jagged yellowed teeth. Let me in, he whispered, his voice wrong, like it was layered with something deeper, darker. I slammed the curtain shut, my hands shaking. Let me in, he repeated, his voice echoing in my head. I didn't sleep that night, and by morning he was gone. No one else saw him, but I know he's still out there. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the knock again.
Story number 8.
When I bought my first home, a little fixer-upper on the outskirts of town, I thought I had found a dream project. It was a small, charming house with a wraparound porch and an old oak tree in the yard. Sure, it needed work, but the price was too good to pass up. The neighbors were friendly enough, though a bit wary when I introduced myself. One of them, an older man named Mr. Grayson, gave me a strange piece of advice the day I moved in. Don't go digging around in the backyard, he said, his voice low. Some things are better left buried. I laughed it off, thinking he was just a superstitious old man. But as I settled into the house, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something wasn't quite right. It started with the noises. At night, when the world was quiet, I'd hear scratching sounds coming from the walls. I thought it might be mice or rats, but no traps I set ever caught anything. Then, the footsteps began, slow, deliberate steps coming from the attic. I went up there with a flashlight one night, determined to prove to myself that it was just my imagination. But the attic was empty, filled only with cobwebs and dusty old boxes. Then there was the dream. I dreamt I was standing in the backyard under the pale light of the full moon. The oak tree loomed over me, its twisted branches casting long skeletal shadows. Beneath the tree, the earth was freshly dug, a shovel sticking out of the dirt. In the dream, I picked up the shovel and started digging. The deeper I went, the stronger the smell of decay became. And then, as I unearthed something wrapped in a filthy, tattered cloth, I woke up, drenched in sweat. The dream haunted me for days, and I couldn't stop thinking about the backyard. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I grabbed a flashlight and a shovel and headed outside. I told myself it was just curiosity, that I needed to prove to myself there was nothing there. The oak tree loomed over me as I started digging. The soil was loose, almost too easy to move, as if it had been disturbed recently. After only a few minutes, my shovel hit something solid. My heart raced as I knelt down and brushed away the dirt with my hands. It was a box. An old wooden box with rusted hinges and strange symbols carved into the lid. The carvings looked like some kind of runes or sigils, though I didn't recognize any of them. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a bundle of rotted cloth, and as I unwrapped it, a wave of nausea hit me. It was a doll. Not a cute porcelain doll, but something crude and unsettling. Its body was made of straw, its face crudely stitched with black thread. Its eyes were hollow sockets, and its mouth was a jagged, gaping line. I felt a chill run down my spine as I held it. There was something deeply wrong about this doll, something that made my skin crawl. That night, the dreams came back, but they were worse. I dreamt I was in my bedroom, but I couldn't move. Something heavy was pressing down on my chest, and I could feel its breath on my face. When I managed to turn my head, the doll was there, sitting on my nightstand, its hollow eyes staring at me. The next morning, I threw the doll back into the box, nailed it shut, and buried it deeper than before. I wanted to forget about it, pretend it had never happened. But the house wouldn't let me. The scratching in the walls grew louder, more insistent. The footsteps in the attic were no longer slow and deliberate. They were frantic, like someone pacing back and forth. And then the whispers started. They came at night, faint and unintelligible, but they always seemed to be coming from the backyard. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and stormed outside, determined to put an end to this madness. But when I got to the spot where I had buried the box, the earth was undisturbed. It was as if I had never dug there at all. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. And then I heard it, a low, guttural laugh coming from the shadows beneath the oak tree. I ran back inside, locking every door and window, but I knew it wouldn't help. The next few days were a blur. I barely slept, barely ate. I was too afraid to close my eyes, too afraid to turn my back on the house. And then, on the third night, it happened. I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. My heart pounded as I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, but before I could turn it on, I saw it. The doll. It was sitting on the edge of my bed, its head tilted, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The doll's stitched mouth began to move, and a voice that was both childlike and demonic, whispered, "You shouldn't have dug it up." The next thing I remember, I was waking up on the floor of my bedroom, the morning sun streaming through the window. The doll was gone, but the feeling of its presence lingered. I sold the house the following week, leaving everything behind. Sometimes I wonder if I should have listened to Mr. Grayson, if I should have left whatever was buried in that backyard alone. But it's too late for me now, because no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, I still hear the whispers. And sometimes, late at night, I wake up to find the doll sitting at the foot of my bed, its hollow eyes staring into my soul.